As I noted in another lecture, In Memoriam is distinctive for its time in its mixing of traditional elegy, mourning the loss of a friend, and a more kind of modern diary form where the grief is expressed in these little swallow bursts of song, these brief utterances that feel almost like diary entries in verse. And this more modern quality that I've likened to Dream Songs by John Barrowman, this latter quality of the poem pulls it away from the traditional linearity we see in a traditional elegy, such as Lycidas or Adonais, as I mentioned. Lycidas by Milton, Adonais by Shelley, as I mentioned earlier in the other lecture. The diary quality of the work takes it away from a traditional linear form. So we ask ourselves, what are some of the unifying principles in this work? A work that again doesn't move from grief to healing in an orderly kind of fashion, but seems to vacillate rather unpredictably between hope and despair, faith and doubt, darkness and light. Well, there are what I've called ritualistic actions that unify the poem. Of course, the most obvious of these would be the celebration of Christmas. We see that occur three times in the poem, each time with a slightly different mood based on that each Christmas is moving further and further away from the actual event of Arthur Hallam's death. We see the poet visiting the door of Arthur Hallam, and we see him visiting gravesite and seeing the yew tree near the gravesite of Arthur Hallam. But in addition to these recurring rituals, there are some recurring images that we need to look at. One, and the most prevalent one, I would say, is the hand. Over and over again, Tennyson talks about wanting to touch Hallam's hand, most powerfully when he describes going to Hallam's house on the first anniversary of Hallam's death on Wimpole Street, and standing outside the door and wanting to touch a hand through the door, but feeling like a guilty thing, feeling like a ghost. Very bizarre that he himself, the living one, would feel like a ghost. Normally, we assume the dead person would be a ghost, and in fact, that's really a way to think about this poem to a certain extent. Is that Tennyson is trying not to be a ghost as someone who is hollowed out of spirit and life and feels utterly attenuated and thin. How can he get blood in his veins again, as it were? So we see the image of the hand, the poet wanting to touch the dead man's hand, to reach from time to eternity, to reach through the portal separating life and death. So the hand is a very visceral way to think about communing with the dead. It's remarkable. Often we would imagine communing with the dead as a more sort of disembodied uh, phenomenon, or my spirit will mingle with the spirit of the dead. But no, there's something so tactile and visceral. So pay attention to how the hand plays out in the poem, and how one way the poet moves closer to feeling less agony is feeling that his hand gets closer to touching Hallam. And this really comes to a kind of apotheosis in section 95, when the poet is reading Hallam's letters and suddenly feels as if he is outside of his body and is mingling with Hallam's spirit. This is in some ways the culmination of all these images of his hand reaching for the hand of the dead man. Another image that recurs is a little more general, but just as prevalent, if not more so, and that is darkness. The word dark shows up, it seems, almost every other poem in this piece. And of course, it's a traditional symbol for thinking about melancholy, for thinking about despair, for thinking about mourning. But this interplay between light and dark is something very much to pay attention to. So if you can track how darkness recedes in the course of the poem and light begins to take over ever so slowly, that's another way for you to think about an organizational principle in the poem that seems so, in some ways, disorganized on its surface. But another recurring symbol, a third I want to mention, is the door. We see the famous moment where it's actually I can't remember which one it is. I think it's poem number 4 actually. Um, no, it's not number 4. It's number 7. It's number 7 where the poet goes, and in fact, this poem number 7 brings all these three symbols together. I'm talking about it's a dark house, and the poet goes to the door of the dark house, and he waits for a hand to come through that door of the dark house. So we see all three of these images. Door as throughout the poem acts as a kind of potential portal, the possibility of reaching through a door from life to death, from time to eternity. Sometimes the door is blocking that. The door is a potential portal we might see. So if you can track the hand, darkness, and door, you'll get a sense of the rhythm of the poem, if not of the poem developing from A to B to C to D, but the poem kind of vacillating back and forth like waves.